Well, good morning to you all. Apologies for a couple of minutes late. We've just had some technical issues to resolve, but thank you for being here. Now, I know it's half term in various guises across the country. Some people are away, some people are still working. It's been at that odd time of year now where some have 2 weeks, some have 1 week, and it's in different places. But welcome if you're here. If you're back at school, I hope the week's gone well. If you're coming to the end of half term, I hope you have a great weekend, and let's see, you'll get back into this next term. Now, this morning, my guest is an ex-head teacher and someone who's now leading the National Association of Able Children in Education, NACE, as some of you will know it. I've asked Rob to come and talk about his work. Now, Rob is not feeling great, and we'll see where we get to, but we'll cope with the voice. But Rob, it's just a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us. I know you're in a hotel. Thank you for just taking a moment to talk to us about what you do.
No, my pleasure, Chris. Thank you for the opportunity of having a discussion this morning.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, look, there's some new technology coming through with this. So if you're watching online and you're on LinkedIn or YouTube, if you've got a comment to make, you can see it's on the screen. The live comments will appear. If there's lots of them, I'll drop them. Otherwise, you won't see Rob's face. But please, if you are listening or you're in the car or whatever you're doing, please do drop a line. No, if you're in the car, please don't. But if you're watching at home, please just leave us a message. Thank you for that. Rob, let's just start with an introduction. Tell us a little about your journey and how you've got to where you are today. What's the journey been?
Well, I mean, my background, I've taught for nearly 30 years in state secondary schools. So a mixture of obviously starting out as a maths teacher, so maths being my subject, and then leading in schools as a senior leader for sort of from head of mathematics on to obviously senior leadership. And I first came across NACE actually at my school. So NACE has actually been around for nearly 40 years now. But I think it was 2005, they introduced something called the NACE Challenge Award. And it's a whole school approach of how to provide effectively for more able learners. So my school at the time, so Heybridge High School in sixth form, we were one of the first to be accredited with the NACE Challenge Award. And we repeated that process another 2 times. And I saw the impact it had on our learners, and something that I feel very passionate about, that actually preparing well for your more able learners, and we'll come to labelling in a moment, because there is a lot of controversy around, well, I think different views around labelling, and I'll discuss that in a moment, and something that, I've come to terms with since I've become NACE CEO. But I became NACE CEO in 2021, having worked as a NACE associate, advertising some of the things that we were doing successfully in our own school. But the key thing for me, and when I look at our NACE Challenge Award schools, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, because that's one arm of what we do, but they're the schools that really engage fully in our framework on how to do this on a whole school level, to provide effectively for these learners. And it's true to say that in all of our schools, you don't see this more able group improving with a gap to the rest. It is that rising tide effect. This provides high expectations, aspirations, opportunities for all learners to achieve, which is why I'm so passionate that it's really important that we continue to focus on this area, which I think, without going on too much, I understand, obviously, with a lot of friends that are still head teachers and working with schools, there's all sorts of things that are thrown at schools. And I think if we're not careful, we can take our eye off the ball on this, that actually this group, like any other group, has its own specific needs. But unlike some other provision, this actually has an impact on a much wider group of learners, a positive impact. So that's why, I took the role as CEO of NACE, and I believe 100% in what we're trying to do.
You've lived it as well as leading it. You've done
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen the impact in my own school. And indeed, the privilege I've had of, I think sometimes, that opportunity to see other schools. So when I worked as a NACE associate, it was a real privilege to be able to go into other fantastic schools and see amazing things that are going on. And there are some that you can implement in your own school straight away. And you almost like slap yourself in the head, why have I never thought of that? there are other things that wouldn't work in your context. And I think that's the important thing. Schools have to consider their own learners. What is it they need? What is it the school community needs? Not a one size fits all, which I think is the temptation with, some products where it's off the shelf and you implement it. It's difficult for those to really have the impact you need. It's a deeper, more complicated thing than that. But as we'll talk a little bit later, I hope, for teacher workload, some of these things are not difficult to put in place, but the real impact becomes when there's a consistency across the whole school, where everyone's driving to those same aims and ambitions. Yeah. And, as you say, we'll get onto the labelling in a moment, but, whoever these more able learners are will be different from subject to subject. It's a dynamic set of data in the fact that it's going to change all the time. People develop at different rates. It is really about challenge for all and high expectations, and understanding with the research, which again, I know, you want to discuss. We've entered some research, but it's really about how we put that in place to support those learners, if you like, teaching to the top. So obviously Megan Mansworth had a book out recently, which really does fit in with our beliefs as well, that you aim high, you teach to the top, and you scaffold up to those high expectations.
Yeah. I guess, Rob, thank you for that. That's a great introduction of what you do. I'm clearly passionate about it, and I don't think any of us could disagree with any of that ambition for learners, because we want to see them be fantastic. I mean, that's the bottom line of Smart Curriculum. Our motto is achieve the exceptional, and we would want that for every child. And I guess the question I begin with, Rob, is this. I find in working with schools, working on curriculum, the start point is this: we're in comprehensive education, therefore it has to be the same shape and size for everybody. But what you've just sort of suggested, that in scaffolding that there is an intention to do something that stretches children in another way. How do you respond in that comprehensive mode to in terms of where your work is placed?
I think a lot of what we do is developing the skills that children need. So if you are really trying to stretch, if you want to use that term, so stretch in a class. So, we tend to find there'll be one or two perhaps subject areas in a school that are achieving higher than others. So you've got areas of, perhaps expertise there. But it's difficult for them to make that real impact. If you are trying to basically create that cognitively challenging learning where children have to think harder. So there's all sorts of terms. James Nottingham calls it cognitive wobble, where you are pushing them, not to a point where it's unachievable, but that is that teacher expertise in knowing how far we can push that, but have those processes of support in place. We don't want children to fail all of the time, but we do want them to have to think hard. Some people call it brain burn, because that's when learning sticks, to coin a simple phrase.
Yeah.
So if we're doing that across the whole school, it's going to be easier, because children will see that in every facet of their learning.
Yeah.
And equally, I would argue that if a school is setting out on trying to do this, then we need to include those stakeholders, so particularly students and parents, and explain why this is going to be beneficial, that we need you to think heard. So there are some schools where I feel that we work with where they feel that the children are too spoon-fed. And therefore, how do we pull back from that? It has to be a deliberate, embedded approach to be able to make that change. Otherwise, students will, as sometimes teachers say to me on training courses, well, my children are just going to give up. They don't want that challenge. So it's how we create that, explain why it's important. And then there are all sorts of different strategies that we can talk about. And obviously my expertise would be in mathematics, where I've seen that work in the most efficient way. But that's really what we're trying to do. We want children to do more of the thinking. There are people that say, I've worked really hard in this lesson, but actually haven't done very much thinking. I would argue that they haven't really hit those cognitively challenging areas, and where we call it that the learning pit, again, back to James Nottingham's research and book, where you hit that eureka moment. If we look back at our own schooling, it's where we've actually battled with something, and you've come to that moment where perhaps you thought it was unachievable. They're the things you remember. Well, there's certainly things I remember. But it's how we have that process set up to be able to enable that to take place is really important, because you can't just up the challenge and what you expect from the children without improving the skills that they need to deal with that higher challenge. There's a psychologist, I can never pronounce his name. He's from America, but it's Hungarian originally. But it's the flow chart. That flow that you hit in lessons where children are so embedded in what they're doing, you almost can't interrupt them. You create that flow with those two things. So if the challenge is high, obviously, and the skills of the children is low, you're going to create that anxiety. And equally, if the skills of the children's high and the challenge is low, you get boredom and apathy. To get that flow in the lesson, you need both things. And that's what I mean by schools identifying. So what is it we need our children to be, or our students to be more successful? Is it that they're too spoon-fed? We need them to be more resilient. Then we need to, obviously, that's another area where we need to explain that, well, mistakes are a good thing. If you never make mistakes, the chances are you're not being pushed. So that whole thing comes together. There are teaching strategies. So it's good news that workload-wise, a lot of the strategies, and I can give a couple of examples if that's helpful, it's not big on teacher workload, because that's really important. But the biggest impact is if there is a whole school approach to this, as I say again, so students see this in all of their learning. It's not like, hang on a minute, why are we doing that there, but we're not here? And that's the challenge always, isn't it? To have that consistency across the school.
That's true across all curriculum design and curriculum delivery. There needs to be, that's where you get in school variance, and that's where we need to have that ability to sort of join the dots between subject silos, as we refer to. There's a couple of bits I just want to emphasize in what you've just said, that we had Marcelo Starikov on the show a few weeks ago. He talks about the learning pit. His book's called The Joy of Not Knowing, and that idea of failure is well, he doesn't call it failure. It's just you don't know the answer. You need to prove, you need to work your way to the answer. It's asking the right questions but you're then saying there needs to be check and challenge in everything they're doing. So why do we just keep repeating the same exercises over and over again? It's not going to make you any better. We need that challenge to move you forward. And I guess one of the things that we do in our sort of talking with schools, I certainly find myself asking middle leaders and senior leaders, how do these children see learning above where they are? How do they see other children being successful and moving forward? Because if they don't, that peer work you've just talked about, that idea of them picking off each other, is just not present. So that has lots of impact on grouping strategies and population design, on development. That's very different around schools. But that seems to me to be the kind of natural step of asking the questions as a leader. That makes sense.
You mentioned questioning there as well. That is it needs to be planned deliberately, of course. It's not that easy, but it is actually that's where I think we see schools making the biggest difference in terms of how they use questioning in the class, and how you get that students have the opportunity to hypothesize and discuss with peers. Obviously, without that, it's very, very difficult. But what we're doing here as well, of course, is not just teaching children to be successful at school. These are all of the skills that they need to be successful beyond their schooling or college or university or whatever it is. So it's not, I would argue, it's not that we haven't got time for this. It's by putting this in place, children will actually achieve more faster, I believe. So the two things go hand in hand. I do get some people say, well, we haven't got time to deal with the skills. And I would argue, as Professor Adey did in many of his research work in the sort of mid-2000s, you can't afford not to, because it's not just going to make them more successful with their achievement in school, but actually in the future, it's everything that they need to be successful out there in the real world as well.
Yeah. And again, all the things that are being said about AI, it's not a replacement, it's an augmentation that we've got to get into. So let's go a little deeper. So the kind of three things you've talked about, if you're okay.
So apologies everybody. It's one of those, I think the lurg is about a lot at the moment, so I do apologize if my throat keeps giving up and I'm coughing occasionally.
I'll try and help by stepping in when I see that. So key barriers. What's stopping this from happening? What do you see in schools that that makes it tough?
I think that one of the toughest things is the requirements, for example, in England of Ofsted, for example. I think there are so many things flying at schools and head teachers at the moment that the more able group, doesn't register in the same way. Back in 2012, there was a massive report, right or wrong, where they were saying that state schools were letting down their most able pupils. In 2016, there was a report saying there'd been little improvement, and yet that seems to have gone off the radar in terms of, it's not high on the priorities, it would seem, at the moment. And we see that if we look at, school Ofsted reports, for example, there's mention of the ability, more able, most able, then there was still mention of challenge. And actually, since 2021, we have the ambitious curriculum, we have equity, because one thing I would argue, this is about equity, because we can't let these learners down like any others. But as I said earlier, I guess the thing that frustrates me is that I've seen, I've lived it, that actually this benefits a much wider group of learners. So I think, inevitably that is one of the issues. And as a small charity, that's something, I found difficult to, have any impact on, in terms of that need from, obvious need in terms of inspection. So I would argue that's one area, but there are other areas, aren't there?
Before you go on, Rob, do you see that? I mean, obviously, there's a massive conversation about special education needs, and there was a time when the argument was it was able as well as those that are challenged in whatever way, but that seems to have gone off the radar. Do you see that coming back? Do you
Yeah, we do. I mean, we see that in terms of how many schools engage with us as well. I mean, that is definitely, at the moment, we're not on the school's radar in that sense. Whereas when you look back at numbers, for example, in 2012-13, that was when membership of MACE was probably at its highest. So schools, kind of find you because they think, we've got to do something about the provision for our more able learners. But as I say, this is really about change for all. I mean, it might be worth, the language is something that's shocked me a little bit, because I didn't realize people had such a strong view. We've had people, for example, if we're exhibiting at conferences, I mean, that's where I met you, Chris, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
A national conference. There are one or two people come quite aggressively as if you're an elitist organization, that, you shouldn't exist. And we're like, well, we are providing our research, which we'll talk about, is back up how you provide effectively for these learners. And these learners, like any others, need their own diet. And, the way I argued is, if I've got 30 children in front of me in a maths class, well, my job is to challenge them all. And I would argue it's very difficult to do that unless you start with the needs of the more able. Now, the ability bit, it might be worth just addressing this, because it's not neutral and it's often ambiguous. And, we agree that labels are problematic if used in a way which is limiting for individual learners. So the idea, I appreciate people's view that more able, well, that means there's less able, but we're not talking about that. We believe that there's a need for schools to have a means of referring to these learners with the potential to achieve to their highest levels.
Yeah.
A lot of people talk about, learning potential. Gifted and talented has kind of disappeared. People have strong views, obviously, that talent, well, is it, God-given in that sense, or whatever term you want to use. So I'm not arguing with these things, but it seems that when one is used, then the language and the labelling and everything around that is quite challenging. But I do want to emphasise, as our core principles state, when we talk about ability, we're referring to a fluid concept. And, I'm incorporating the potential or capacity for high attainment. And if you don't give all children, back to that point, opportunities, if you like, to show what they can do, how can you possibly identify whether you want to call them your gifted and talented learners, as they still do in certain countries, your more able learners, whether it's those with high potential? It is about creating that curriculum where it's deliberate and planned, because you can't rely on it happening by chance in one or two areas. It needs to be deliberately planned and placed in the curriculum where all children have that opportunity. And, maths is a subject where a lot of people I think people set more in maths than perhaps most other subjects. There are others that set as well. And there are some schools that are successful with mixed ability. They're rarer in mathematics. But we're talking about every single group that you have pushing that. And that's that teacher expertise, which you can't get away from. It's so important. Understanding how you create that cognitive wobble for the ones with the highest potential in that class and support everyone with those same high expectations. So I think the language, the labeling is really complicated, as I've said, but they are a group of learners, these people with high potential, where the research that we've done shows that these things support that learning. But as I said, the frustration I have is that this benefits, and I'm not saying we don't need the support for these other learners, but like any other group, they do, but actually as a consequence, provide effectively for them and a much wider group benefit. So surely it's an important thing to have a focus on in schools.
Absolutely. I'm going to pick up on a couple of bits you said there. So this thing about setting is that we always come down to two extremes. It's setting or it's mixed ability. And I've asked the question many times, so what's in the middle? And we use a term called stranding, which is effectively what you're saying, but you do need some separation, you do need some difference of ability, respecting different abilities. But the other thing is that thing about how you label it. You said it's fluid, that it happens, some people fly later, some people fly early. That needs to be tested and explored. The thing I just got, this group that was gifted and talented was generally a labeled group, and but the reality is that everybody's got their own propensities. You say you're a mathematician. I was a technologist. We've got people on the team that were English staff or historians. We have different propensities, but we show that in different ways. And then whatever system we come up with surely has to respect that propensity range, because you can be gifted and talented or able or brilliant I was just thinking about the Brilliant Club. I mean, that just came to mind as you were talking. But that idea, you can be brilliant in different areas. And I think what you're saying is we just got to be fluid and respond to it wherever it is.
And provide as many opportunities as we can. I mean, it never ends. That's the excitement in a way, because you can always improve. You're never there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of one thing that's always is very challenging, entrepreneurial skills. There are students in front of you that may be struggling academically. Perhaps school isn't ideally for them, but they're actually going to be successful in the economy, in the economic futures. And it's how we give those. It's that our later research shows that belonging. When you can genuinely celebrate success, that can transform a child in school as well, can't it? Because you find that sense of belonging, you're not against each other anymore, you're actually working together, and that's what you're trying to create for every child in your school, that opportunity to achieve highly in an area of significance for that child. I mean, that's essentially what you're trying to do. Definitely. I'm not going to say I'm an expert here, because I've battled with that for years. How do we identify entrepreneurial skills, and how do we provide those opportunities? Because I'm thinking of things like Young Enterprise that was available, as a technologist, I'm sure you'll be aware of. That was a fantastic project where I saw it transform some learners that were struggling perhaps in school, maybe excluded, whatever, but they had real success in that area. We had a fantastic technology department in the school where, and it transformed them, because they give the best of what they can do across the board once they felt that sense of belonging in the school. Yeah. And with our latest research, I mean, perhaps we'll go back a stage and just explain where the research came from first, because actually we found back in 2018, it was before I joined NACE as CEO, we started our Making Space for Able Learners project, because actually we found there wasn't a great deal of research readily available with a lens on the more able. So that's why we started our own research, looked at what our NACE Challenge Award schools did, and put that together where the consistencies were. In how you create those cognitive challenging classrooms and schools. So that was our first phase. In 2022, we did our second phase, following those interruptions to schooling, where we looked at how we rethink assessment. So on that, we provided guidance and exemplars to help schools transform assessment into an integral part of the cognitively challenging learning process. And then our third phase, which we've now almost completed. We're hoping the publication will be out at the end of this term, or certainly probably launched in January. But that's devoted to exploring how schools can remove barriers to opportunity and achievement for all. So again, central to our vision and a response to the widespread awareness of disadvantages and inequities in the provision and outcomes. So what we've looked at there is how essentially we move barriers to learning for learners who encounter disadvantage in any of its many forms, not just those, again, that labelling part. Some would argue it's helpful, but you don't want to label the students as disadvantaged because the onus is on them to get out of that situation, if you like, whereas the onus is on us to support them to remove the barriers that they have. That's where we started that, because we found, particularly with a focus on the more able, the research and evidence wasn't always easy to find. So that's why we started that process. And again, it's crucially important. I look back at teaching. I mean, I started in '93, so showing my age a little bit. And I look at some of the things that, we had to teach. And I did feel at the time, well, where's the evidence behind this? There are some things, I mean, I won't say what they are, but there are one or two strategies that I thought, well, what is this? I can't see how this is working. Yeah. So one thing that's really positive at the moment, I think that research is, central to what schools are trying to achieve. And that's really important, that it is research, backed by research, that these strategies work. So I think jumping on that in 2018 was really important for NACE to show that, the evidence backing to what we're trying to achieve.
Rob, can I say that, because I know, we've had various people on the show that are doing research or PhD, deliverers or students. And there's a comment actually that Ross McGill in the Teacher Toolkit has said, there's loads of research out there. Don't just read the extract, get into it, because there are some people that are doing so, particularly on the brain science stuff, that will just read a little snippet and it, it's very misplaced. And actually, it's great that we've got this research, and the work of the Endowment Foundation is great at exposing that to us. But just to please the people, read the stuff and get into it and talk to people and look at good practice and share it, because we need to get really into this stuff and not just read the top line. But sorry, Rob,
no, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I always thought I was quite a good teacher, but I'm embarrassed at some of the things, I've done in the past in terms of, what we now know. I mean, just taking something simple as enrichment is an interesting topic, because I'm not suggesting for one moment enrichment is not important outside of the classroom, but it still needs to start in the classroom. Otherwise, you're always creating those barriers immediately that some have, the if you like, the procedures and the setup outside of school where they can really benefit from it, whereas others don't have that. So, I think it needs to start in the classroom. And I look back at, in my subject, we're very fortunate to have so many amazing materials out there that are free for all the schools. And I'm thinking of the maths challenges. We used to put our top sets into the maths challenges with little preparation, because they were good at maths. And then, I've done some research on perfectionism, and you think, what was I doing? There are children there that did not, like to fail at all. And we gave them no support because they were good at maths. They had a go at something. And equally, when we gave every set the opportunity to look at some of these styles of problems and prepare them properly, we had children from all sets then having a go at the maths challenge.
Yeah.
And it's again, that has uncovered some ability and potential that we wouldn't have known of had we not given every child the opportunity to show what they could do. Because as a teacher, you hear that question, you think, hang on a minute, can you say that again? What are you thinking? And, somebody that's just always been struggling with mathematics, actually, because perhaps they didn't care about it, they were never engaged with it, but actually had that hidden potential. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. I'm not suggesting that, if you do set in maths, that the lower set you would give as much to. You don't want them to struggle, but it is giving every child the opportunity to show what they can do.
Isn't the point that
systems, I think are just so important. And, I can think of students that joined us that they would have gone in the if you want to call it the bottom set. That's obviously the problem with setting all of the time, isn't it? Yeah. But actually, go on to achieve AA stars in maths and further maths at A level, because, those opportunities to show what they can do, and then again, to feel successful and want to learn more, you can transform a child's education. Now, there's always individual cases like that you can talk about. I mean, crikey, if you've taught for as long as I have, you're always going to get those. But it's much smaller things than that as well, giving children that opportunity to problem solve, develop problem solving skills that we weren't really giving to anybody when I look back, because we weren't preparing the higher sets to go into it either. So, things like that. And, those that teach in mixed ability, there are low threshold, high ceiling tasks where you've got a task where everybody can have a go at it. There's no threat. It's easy to understand what we're trying to do, but there's hidden, I think in mathematics, again, Enrich provide lots of these tasks. And there's hidden things in there where you can develop and, turn things into proof and, real high levels of mathematics while other people are accessing the task as well.
Yeah.
And then the one thing that transformed my learning, just one small example, was goal-free problems. The number of times this really came to a head when there was a GCSE group in year 10 that were doing the higher tier, but were at the lower end, if you like, aiming for sort of 6s and 7s in their grades. So to give you an idea of the group we had in terms of apparent potential. But I looked at as I always do in year 10, I looked at their year 9 exam papers, and half the paper was left blank. So those that don't know, in maths, they gradually get harder, the questions. So you start with the lower level questions and it gets increasingly harder. So it's quite common to see the second half of paper almost untouched. And for 20 odd years of teaching, I used to say, well, why have you left them blank? Well, I didn't understand the question, sir. That sort of approach.
Yeah.
And by saying, but why don't you look at the information that you're given and problem solve, do something with it, from your experience that you've, got in maths. It never had an impact. Goal-free questions, again, really simple for teachers. It's not bad on workload. You just remove the question and work out what you can from this information. It takes the threat of the question away, gives children time to really look at a problem, and what a difference that made. It was incredible. It removed the threat of a question. So if I don't quite understand the question, well, let's have a look deeper at what we've got there. I must add, I'm not teaching children not to read the question, but it was to develop that resilience and that problem-solving skills. So, there are lots of little things like that we have come across in our research. That's an
approach, isn't it? You'll suggest a goal-free questioning is just taking the pressure away. And I hear so many people saying that. When this is not teaching to the test, not all of that other stuff. It's developing resilience, getting children so that they're inquisitive, so that they are using that inquiry.
Metacognition, because it's bringing back what they've learned previously to a source of information rather than that one answer and the one question, the one answer approach. That's where the goal-free questions work really well. And again, for teacher workload, it's an absolute doddle. You just remove the question and work out what you can from this information. So it's, I'm very conscious that, teachers, it has to be, and the good thing is with the research, there are many things you can do that do not add to teacher workload. And I could argue from an assessment point of view as well, actually can improve teacher workload by actually, the assessment strategies in our second book, things like exit tickets and a lot of things that we talk about there. The onus is more on the child to do those improvements, and the teacher becomes more that facilitator in that aspect. The good news, as I say, and that's, I guess, why I'm passionate, because I'm not adding to teacher workload, but there is that it works best, as we see in our Challenge Award schools, when there's a whole school approach to this. So we're all working, they say, we're identifying what is it, what's the one thing we would change for our students if we could, and then work on that together through the processes that that we obviously have, that we provide.
Look, is there anything else that you want to say? So you've kind of laid out the journey to this research. So this new research in your book that's coming out later in the term or the new year, is there anything else you wanted to say about that, Rob?
Well, I think in terms of the removing barriers for learners who encounter disadvantage, it's not surprising, is it? But that sense of belonging and nurture is critical. And I guess, obviously, we are where we are in terms of attendance issues and things like that. But there is an incredible amount of money spent on taxis, buses, and everything else. And I just think, can we look a bit more long term and think about, well, how do we change the diet of what the learners get in school to hopefully encourage them to continue coming into school?
Yeah.
I'm not blaming any schools, obviously. I left as a senior leader, I suppose, in 2021. I'm fully aware through colleagues that are still head teachers that the issues, if anything, are getting worse in terms of that community aspect, that, everything is brought to schools by parents now, because it seems sometimes that schools are the last thing in the community where you can actually speak to someone face to face. So, police issues and everything else. But I just think if we can look at how we improve that sense of belonging for these learners, how we can negotiate that area of genuine success and celebration, that is a key part of the new research. I mean, it's only one part of it, but that's the bit I think I highlighted to me that really dawned on me when we were doing this research, that nurture, that, identifying what is it that they need on an individual basis, rather than perhaps some of the systems that are in place on a more of a whole scale. So there are things that obviously schools do with their pupil premium money, but actually going back to how can we set up a system where the individual needs are addressed? Is there somebody in the school that can act as that mentor that has similar interests to the child? In bigger secondary schools, that's not difficult to do. Using the form tutor registration systems, whatever it is that schools still have in place, can we use that more effectively so that we can help to identify the things that we need to remove those barriers to learning?
Yeah.
And there are some schools doing amazing things, and that's, with the case studies that we have in the book, again, that privilege for me of being able to go into schools and think, wow, and how we share that. I mean, that's a big part of our network, finding more ways for our members, because we are a membership organisation. I should have said that at the start. And the NACE Challenge Award is just one aspect where some of our members engage further because they want to work on that whole school approach I've talked about. But as a membership organisation, one of the most important things that we offer is opportunities to network through online and in-person events, because having that opportunity to discuss with somebody the other side of the country that's got the same issues as you is incredibly valuable. And we've introduced our member spotlights this year, because what I'm trying to create, rather than having to be a NACE associate, I mean, I don't want to put people off becoming a NACE associate if that's something they're interested in doing, but obviously, to have that opportunity of seeing some amazing things happening in school, and for an expert in the school to be able to, talk about the journey they took to get to that point, is really, really valuable. So we've introduced those member spotlights now, so that we have one school, very simply, 40-minute session, explaining this is where we've got to, this is why NACE thought it was brilliant, and this is our journey to how we got there. Because again, they can support other schools with, generally, if you're the first person to do that, there'll be pitfalls along the way. So, being able to support other schools into that process, I think is really, really important.
And so if anybody wants to get hold of you or come to it, so the website would be what?
It's just nace.co.uk. There is a nace.org that you get an engineering firm, so it's nace.co.uk. Right. All the email addresses to contact us there. info@nace.co.uk if you've got any questions at all. That's the one where all of my colleagues will be able to access that information and get you pointed in the right direction to whatever query you may have. But if there's anything you want to discuss or disagree with, of course, that's what's important. That's that challenge, I think, that is really helpful to us as well. Please do get in touch.
So, look, Rob, I'm conscious you've done brilliantly with your voice, and I'm not going to push you any further, other than to ask you the same question I ask every guest at the end of their sort of presentation or their conversation. If in the system you could change one thing, you referred to a minute ago to a one change about process, but if in kind of a bigger picture, if you could change one thing or influence one change, what would it be?
It'd be the importance of those students that are more able to be on that agenda again, because, as I say, if you're, I'm under no illusions, if you're new to being a head teacher, it's a tough job. There's all sorts of things thrown at you, and without that appreciation that providing successfully for, again, whatever we want to call it, whether it's high potential, more able learners, whatever it is, but to have that specified as an important area, an essential area of the work of a school because of the impact it has on such a wider group. That is clearly that's the one thing I battle to change.
Yeah, no, I quite understand. Rob, just stay with me for a minute. I'm going to do the closing piece, but thank you so much for just having the conversation this morning, and just appreciate everything that you've said. I can see so many connections with people that we've had on the show and conversations that are going on at the moment. I think this needs to be back on the agenda. It needs to be talked about, and in the way that you've described it, this is about raising challenge for every child. This is about the impact across the system. But Rob, thank you so much. Stay with me for a second. I will be with you now. So thank you to Rob and NACE and the work that they're doing across the nation. It's much appreciated. And you've heard the links, and we've talked about where that is. Just to say, we continue into this new term, this new half term up to Christmas. We've got guests lined up, some really interesting conversations coming through over the next few months. We're out and about speaking at various events, and you'll see some of those linked to our conversations. We're in Wales, we're in Stratford, we're in Middle England, talking about the stuff that Smart Curriculum has been doing, but linking up with our colleagues. So please, if you see us or you see our work on LinkedIn, please do comment, do come and say hello, have a conversation. I'm really blessed the number of people that come along and say, hi Chris, I saw your show, really interested, can we just talk about? It's been really an interesting expression. Newsletters are going out every week. Deep dives, you'll see them on Substack. If you've got we're going into deeper subjects, there's quite a lot going on in preparation for the curriculum and assessment review, and so the responses to that, lots of people asking, what do we do? Well, we won't know until we've seen the report, but there's some things that we've been talking our way through. And the international colleagues that are here, thank you for your presence. Again, if there's things that relate to your area, because there's curriculum change going on across the world, come and talk. We can link you up with people like Rob and others, if that's what you need. So please do keep sending your messages. If you're seeing this as a recorded version, it'll be on Substack, it will be on YouTube, it will be on LinkedIn or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast content. Please do drop us a line, like, share and subscribe. It helps immensely. It gets the message out. More and more people are watching and listening and reading, and we appreciate every one of you. Thank you for being here today. We'll see you in our next episode in 2 weeks' time. I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks very much.